Hi, everybody. My name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society. I'm going to be your tour guide today as we go through the modules and we teach you how to participate in the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, well, at least the second version of the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. I'm going to drop a link in the chat here. And as I do that, I will just remind you that there are some features of Zoom here that we'll be using throughout the day. One of those features is the chat. This is a feature where some of the attendees and folks that will introduce themselves to you in a couple minutes here will be dropping links there and sharing information with you. You're also welcome to make comments and do other things in that chat, interact with each other. If you choose the gray drop-down button in the chat, you can select individual participants, I believe. And initiate a conversation with someone if you'd like to. If you have a question, particularly a question for me or for anybody else on the panel, there's also a Q&A feature. So if you hover your mouse over the screen, you will also see a Q&A feature there. And that is where you can choose or where you can ask questions. And it may be that we end up answering that question live. If it seems like it's a pertinent question, or I have the folks who are going to introduce themselves in a minute here are going to also be active and answering questions there as they relate to, how to participate in the Atlas or bumblebee conservation or other things. There's also a raise hand feature there. I would ask that you not use that feature, particularly while I'm talking. This is just a personal pet peeve of mine. When I'm talking, it just creates like a yellow flash, and I just find it to be distracting. So if lots of people are raising their hand or whatever, I just find it a little distracting. If we're at a break and you have a question that you feel like you want to speak, that's fine. You can raise your hand at that point and we could unmute you or whatever. But if you could just avoid using that while I'm talking, I would very much appreciate it. This webinar is being recorded. So we hope within the next week or so that we'll be able to post the modules online so that you could rewatch them or share them with a friend. So please know that that will be there. I think that's all of the logistics that I wanted to mention. Before I go on, while I'm going to be the main voice that you will hear today, there's a number of other folks, as you can probably see on the screen now, that are joining us, and I certainly couldn't do this project without them, and would like them to introduce themselves. So I'm going to go counterclockwise on my screen. So Joel, that means you're up.
Thanks, Rich. My name is Joel Sauter. I'm the wildlife diversity biologist for Idaho Fish and Game based out of the Clearwater region. I coordinate the Atlas across all of Idaho. So from those of you from Idaho, thanks particularly for tuning in. I'll be your point of contact if you have any questions after this training's done. I'll put my contact information here in the link, and feel free to reach out afterwards if you have lingering questions. So thanks for your attendance today.
And you're next.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Potter, and I'm a wildlife biologist based in Olympia, Washington. I work for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife statewide, and I specialize in conservation of insects, primarily butterflies, moths, and bees. I just want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. I'm really looking forward to hearing Rich's information. Even though I've heard it before, I'm still looking forward to it. So it's going to be a great time. And I just, again, want to say thank you so much. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game, who Joel just spoke from that agency, and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and Xerces partnered together to start the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas with a large contribution from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Wildlife and State Sport Fishing and Recreation Fund. I can't even say it, but I didn't want to use an acronym. so those are some of the partners behind this that have made this possible. Again, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us.
Leaf.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leif Richardson. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society. I'm based in Riverside, California, in Southern California. And I'm new to Xerces. I've been here about a month and a half. And my primary responsibility is to run an atlas project for bumblebees in California, the California Bumblebee Atlas. We are just getting that off the ground this summer, and it's going to have a very similar structure to the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. And so I'm here both to help facilitate this workshop today, but also to pay attention to this information because I'm relatively new to Xerces. I've been working with Rich for many years on and off in other capacities, but I just joined the organization recently. So excited to be here. And I probably will do some survey work in Southern Oregon as part of this project this summer.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I also just want to acknowledge that in addition to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Fish and Game, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife are also important partners on this project. And one of them couldn't join us today as a panelist, but we're very glad to have them along as partners. I'm going to try to get a sense, and we'll use these polls throughout the day, trying to get a sense for who you all are. So yeah, we just launched a poll there, and if you're new to Zoom, you should be able to answer the questions that pop up here. And just sort of curious as to who our audience is today before we get started. Okay, interesting. So it looks like about a third of you have participated before, and around 2/3 of you have not yet participated but are looking forward to it, including a few people, or about a quarter of people, that have just heard about the project. So this is all great. Welcome to those of you that have participated before, and to those of you that are brand new to the project, we're so glad that you found us. This has been a really fun, engaging project that I hope I'll share some about what we've accomplished over the last 3 years, as well as what we hope to do over the next 3 years. At this point, I am just going to get started. The way that the day is structured, there's 4 different modules that I'll be sharing with you. The first one is sort of an overview of bumblebee ecology and conservation, and I'll also share a bunch of the outcomes that we learned from the first version of the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas project. And then we'll jump into kind of the focus of the second version of this project is to really think about 4 species that are in decline. And we'll have a specific module on learning more about those 4 species, including what we learned in the first version and what we hope to learn about them in the second version. And I think this might clarify for you all what we're hoping you will help us with over the next several years. And then we'll dive into sort of the nuts and bolts of the project: how to adopt a grid cell, how to sign up for a Bumblebee Watch account, and then how to conduct a survey and how to submit your data. We'll basically go from A to Z, teaching you how to participate the best we can over Zoom. I will say that in the past, we've taught these workshops in person, and it's much preferred by all of us, but this is where we are. But it does seem that COVID we're potentially getting it under wraps, and hopefully sometime over the next couple of years, we can be back doing these workshops in person. And you can come back and get yourself a t-shirt. All right, I am gonna get started. Let me share my screen here. Oops. go. Okay. Can I just get a verbal from somebody on the panel here that you guys can see my slides?
Yes, looks good.
Looks good.
Thanks. So again, I just want to take a minute here to acknowledge all the partners on this project. It's a collaborative effort. We couldn't do it. It's a really nice model of a partnership between some nonprofits and state agencies and funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So incredibly wonderful partnership and hopefully a model that other states can follow as we move towards conserving bumblebees and other pollinators. I know that a number of us have dropped our email addresses in the chat already. They're also here on the screen now. So if you want to write down the contact information of the right person from your state, feel free to jot that down. All of this information is also available on our website. And the website is pnwbumblebeeatlas.org, which is where you'll find a lot of the information. And I'm pretty sure at the very beginning here, I dropped a link in the chat, which would take you to materials that you can use to follow along today, including the participant handbook and other things. So that would also take you basically to the website. Okay, just a quick brief introduction into the Xerces Society for those of you who may not have heard of us before. We're a nonprofit organization. We're based in Portland, Oregon. The focus of our organization is to conserve all invertebrates, so all animals without a backbone. And we do this through a number of different programs. We have a native pollinator program, which is largely a lot of people, well, we have close to 30 staff working all over the United States. And most of their job is to work with farmers and help farmers put pollinator habitat on their farms to increase pollination services. We also have an endangered species program, and both Leaf and I work for the endangered species program. Our role is to assess invertebrates for their extinction risk. And if we find that there is extinction risk, we do all kinds of things to advocate for their protection. Sometimes this means advocacy, sometimes it means science, sometimes it means writing endangered species petitions, sometimes it means land management. It's a lot of different factors that go into conserving invertebrates. We also have an aquatic invertebrate program that works on the conservation of freshwater mussels, as well as stream water indicators and a lot of other factors. And then we have a butterfly conservation program, which increasingly is working on the monarch butterfly, which, as most of you are probably aware, is also imperiled. And then we have a pesticide program that sort of serves as an umbrella to all of these other programs. As you can imagine, pesticides are having impacts on all invertebrates on the planet for the most part. And we go about our work in a lot of different ways. We do a lot of education, outreach, we do science and advocacy, we have publications, and I'll share some of those resources with you as we go through the day today. But sometimes my office looks like what you see in the picture here, and we're out doing rare species surveys. More often my office looks like what you see behind me. I feel like I've been in my room for a year. We also use a lot of community science, and that's what this project is, right? It's engaging the public in a project, having them go out and help us collect data, and then using those data to make informed conservation decisions. It's a really nice model to increase the reach and increase the scientific reach and the ability to pull data into a project like this. So we have community science projects on bumblebees, like Bumblebee Watch and the Atlas programs. We have freshwater mussel community science projects. We have the Western monarch Thanksgiving counts. We do dragonfly community science and a lot of others as well. And then we also do advocacy. Sometimes this means standing in front of in state legislatures or even in Washington, D.C., advocating for new policies and things to protect invertebrates, whether that be on the pesticide front or for endangered species. And then we do a lot of education and training. Since 2008, we've reached over 100,000 professionals And we've done trainings in all 50 US states, as well as in Canada and Mexico, and Europe and Asia. And then in addition to that, this is largely through the pollinator program that I mentioned. We do a ton of on the ground conservation. Over the last couple of decades, we have, we have protected nearly 1 million acres in North America, and we've protected and restored over 1.5 million acres through work with the Forest Service and BLM throughout North America as well. So lots of important conservation work happening through our organization throughout North America. We are a member-supported organization. For those of you that are already Xerces Society members, thank you so much for your support. If you're interested in joining our team, we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. We just put out the 50th anniversary of the publication Wings, which is our member magazine. Has great essays in there about all sorts of invertebrate conservation things that have been going on over the last 50 years, including these Atlas projects and why we launched these Atlas projects. That's an article that I wrote in that magazine. It just came out. So consider becoming a member if you're not already. All right. So here's the day as it's laid out. We've got the 4 modules, Bumblebee Ecology and Conservation, learning more about these rare species I've mentioned, how to participate from A to Z, and then we'll end with photography and ID tips. We'll also take a couple of breaks in here. I know 4 hours is a long time to sit in front of your computer, particularly on a Saturday. So thank you again all so much for being here. It's really, really, really important. Okay, so as we get started with Bumblebee Ecology and Conservation, which is really the goal, is to learn more about this from these Atlas projects. Why are we doing this? From just a basic standpoint, and we'll get a little bit more into this, some of this as we move through the day, but we know that bumblebees are essential pollinators. We lack baseline data sets about these populations. We just don't know what a healthy population looks like in many cases, and even where these animals are living. We also know that there are some North American species that are imperiled. Some of them may be on the brink of extinction. And we're lacking clear distribution information. Significantly over the last 20 years, the distribution information that we have maps human population density. So it's largely just mapping human populations. And that's great. It's good to know how bumblebees are doing in cities and towns and along roadsides. But more importantly, we need to know how these animals are doing in our wild landscapes. And so we're hoping to gather more information about that. On top of that, as we think about conserving these animals and doing land management and creating habitat, we're lacking the knowledge to do this in an evidence-based way. We know some about bumblebees in general, but when we think about individual species and how to help an individual species recover, we just don't have that information. And so more local, more specific knowledge is needed so that we can change our management policies at a landscape scale and improve the situation for these animals and help them recover and repopulate their former ranges. And this lack of knowledge is a barrier to effective conservation. And so we need to fill these information gaps. And so what we've done is we've engaged community scientists throughout Oregon, Washington, Idaho to gather this information. We've had incredible support. Over 1,000 people have contributed bumblebee observations to this project over the last 3 years. We've collected over 22,000 bumblebee records of 24 different species. We've collected 630 SGCN bumblebee observations and over 1,500 habitat surveys throughout the region. All of this has led to one of the most comprehensive data sets of bumblebee observations available anywhere in North America. There are very few places that have this kind of coverage over such a short period of time. So it's provided a tremendous snapshot of how our bumblebee populations are doing. And this will allow us to assess these animals now, but it also provides a condition to which future conditions can be compared. We can repeat this survey in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, and in 100 years, and then see how these animals are doing. These baseline data sets did not exist previous to this effort. And now we have a pretty good baseline data set for the Pacific Northwest. We set out in the first iteration of the project to survey 396 grid cells. So we divided the states up into equal area grid cells and conducted surveys within those grids. We were able to complete surveys in 354 of those. So over 75% of those grids that we selected were sampled in the first iteration. We're hoping to fill those gaps that you see, the gray cells and the blank cells, over the next 3 years so that we can completely finish the picture. From all of these data, we've been able to do important things like pull plant lists for rare species. These are the plants that the Western bumblebee visited over the first 3 years of the project. And from these, we're able to think about which plants that we might use in a restoration project. And these are just examples right now. This isn't actually something that I've done or that we actually are doing. We're writing a report about this right now. But this is the kind of information that's incredibly important. So if we're going to create habitat to try to support the Western bumblebee, one of the things we would do is probably try to put some of these plants in the ground where that animal has a chance to recover. And this project, the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, has served as a model for other states. We launched the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas in 2019 and the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas in 2020. And then in 2021, we will be launching the California Bumblebee Atlas, as Leif mentioned. And the really cool thing about these is that they are dramatically changing data collection patterns. So if you look at this map in the beginning, that's sort of bumblebee data as it came in. And you can see that in the beginning, it largely maps cities. You can find cities and towns and transportation corridors. But then when the states turn green, that is when we have launched a Bumblebee Atlas project. And you can start to see the boundaries of the state fill in, which means that we're getting outside of those population centers, outside of those transportation corridors, and actually really learning what's happening with these populations in the landscapes that are supporting them. So we're hoping, for instance, that California will start to fill out over the next 3 years. But you can already see the outlines of Nebraska and Missouri happening, even only after 1 and 2 years of data collection. And I just want to take this moment for all of you that have participated and contributed to this project over the last 3 years. Thank you so much. Your efforts have been absolutely astounding. Every time I sit down and look at the data and think about how many of you have spent hours of time out there collecting data and sharing it with us, it's just incredible. It's so inspiring to know that we have a team of bumblebee conservation experts spread throughout this 3-state area out there doing science, contributing to a real conservation project, and also being advocates for bumblebee conservation. So for all of you that have been here before, thank you so much. Your contributions are absolutely invaluable. And for those of you that are brand new, welcome to the team. We couldn't be happier to watch our project and our team grow. Okay, so now we're going to dive a little bit into an overview of bumblebee ecology and conservation. When you start in this work, one of the things that we find is that, and it's probably not true of most of the people on this webinar, but there are a lot of people in this world who wonder why anyone would want to conserve invertebrates. A lot of people think of them as the slimy, stingy things that fill the corners of their house and that they're actively trying to get rid of. That is true maybe of a couple of different species, but from a biodiversity perspective, 90% of the animals on the planet are an invertebrate. 90% of the animals are invertebrates. That's an astounding number. And not only are they incredibly abundant in terms of their diversity and number of species, but they're also incredibly important from an ecosystem service function perspective. So they're decomposing, they're out there helping nutrients return to the soil so that the nutrient cycle can continue and plants can continue to thrive, and that animals can continue to eat those plants and thrive. So the nutrient cycle is dependent on invertebrates. Biocontrol is largely conducted by invertebrates. And what I mean by biocontrol is in our forests, in our farm fields, there are lots of animals. Most of those are actually invertebrates that like to eat those plants. And in the absence of a predator insect that would maybe eat some of those animals that would otherwise defoliate some of our forests and farm fields, we would need to depend on chemicals, right? So we would spray chemicals in a farm field to prevent them from being defoliated. But if we have a functioning ecosystem and there are biocontrol predators like wasps and some flies, then we don't need those chemical inputs. And so invertebrates are incredibly important for conducting biocontrol in our natural areas and in our healthy farm systems. They're also the base of the food chain. So everything from songbirds to fish to a lot of other aquatic animals are feeding on invertebrates directly. And so they're helping to support that food chain as it moves all the way up. So then there's birds, obviously, that eat fish, and salmon are eaten by bears and other things like that. So it moves up the food chain. And without those invertebrates, all of a sudden we have big problems. So in addition to those that ecosystem function, invertebrates also are providing ecosystem services. And in this case, we're talking about pollination. So pollination is basically the transfer of pollen from the male parts of a flower to a female parts of a flower. It's reproduction. And most plants on the planet, around 85% of plants on the planet, require an animal for pollination services. So they need an animal to move that pollen from the male parts to the female parts in order for that flower to produce a fruit. And those fruits, many of them we eat, but they're also how all of these plants reproduce. So without pollinators, we lose a lot of the flowering diversity on the planet. The slide that you see now is sort of a pollination 101, in case you don't remember this from your high school or college biology classes, but it's basically just a pollinator, which is often a bee, facilitates this movement of pollen from the male parts to the female flower. So a bee goes to a flower and it collects pollen or gets pollen on its body. It flies to the next flower, either on the same plant or even better on a different plant, and then moves those gametes and allows fertilization to happen, which then, develops into a fruit, or when it's successful, develops into a fruit. And this ecosystem service makes pollinators what we call a keystone species. And a keystone species is an animal or a group of animals that are more important than you might expect just by their size or their abundance. So if you sort of just looked at the tiny little bees in your backyard, you might not think that they were all that important for the world. But in fact, 85% of flowering plants are dependent on them, as well as they're incredibly important to crop production. 10% of economic value comes from pollinators. And that actually leads to 1 out of 3 bites of food that we put into our body. So pollinators are incredibly important for not just feeding us, but also for feeding a lot of other animals and for helping those plants to reproduce. And just to give you some sense of what this looks like from a practical scale, this is what a grocery store looks like. This is actually a Whole Foods department, the produce department, on sort of a natural or average Saturday. A few years ago, a Whole Foods store partnered with the Xerces Society to help their shoppers understand what it looks like, what our world would look like if we didn't have bees anymore. And so when you take bees out of the equation, all of a sudden, a lot of our most delicious and most nutritious fruits completely disappear from the shelves. It does not mean that we would starve. There are still plants out there. A lot of plants sort of self or are wind pollinated. And so there would still be some plants, but a lot of our most delicious and most nutritious foods would disappear. And this cascades well beyond the produce aisle. If you start thinking about dairy products and the clover and other plants that cows eat, we lose a lot of our dairy products as well. So it's not just the produce aisle that has these effects. It would cascade throughout the grocery store. As I said earlier, 1 out of 3 bites of food that we put into our bodies. And again, I've said this, but it's not just humans that pollinators are feeding. It's also songbirds and grizzly bears. Most of their diet is made up of fruits, nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. And those things come from pollinators for the most part. And so pollinators are feeding the world. There are 6 main groups of insect pollinators. There are butterflies, which is the upper left here, and then I'll move sort of left to right, top to bottom. So butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. And bees are really the world's most important and most efficient pollinators because of their life history. Bees actually eat nectar and pollen both as larvae and adults. So nectar is their source of energy, and pollen is their source of protein. And so bees are actually intentionally collecting pollen, both to eat it, but then also to bring back to their nests, and they lay their eggs directly on balls of pollen. And there are no other animals that really do this. It's certainly not at the scale that bees do. So bees are intentionally covering their bodies in pollen to move it back to their nest. So because of that, they're actually intentionally moving pollen through the landscape in ways that other animals do not. Most other animals may go to a flower to get a sip of nectar for some sugar. They might also eat some pollen, but they're not going to intentionally put it on their bodies to move it through the landscape. And that's one of the things that make bees such fantastic and efficient pollinators. That said, bees aren't doing this on purpose, right? They're not actually intentionally pollinating plants. But it's just that since they cover their bodies in pollen, they become such efficient pollinators. And all bees have these really cool, or most bees at least, have these very cool structures that have adapted to help them carry pollen through the landscape. This picture is zoomed into what's called a bee's scopa. And the scopa is a pollen carrying mechanism that a lot of bees have on their hind legs. And if you look very closely at your screen, you can probably see that those hairs are really unique. They almost all look like a bottle brush. So they're branched hairs. And those branches on those hairs, instead of just being linear like the hairs on our head or on our arms, really helps them grab onto and hold pollen. It keeps the pollen from falling off. And so bees are often covering their bodies in pollen, and then they're grooming that pollen off of their bodies onto their hind legs. So they use their forelegs and mid legs to help groom that pollen onto their hind legs and keep it there until they get back to their nest, when they scrape it off and then lay their eggs on it. Bumblebees are a little bit different than that in that they have a specialized scopa that we call a corbicula, and that's circled here. And instead of a densely hairy area, bumblebees, and actually honeybees as well, have this thing called a corbicula. And a corbicula is a big basket. It's surrounded by these long bristles called corbicular fringe. And the reason theirs is a basket rather than just dense hairs is they actually have adapted to mix the pollen with a little bit of nectar. So it makes a cake. And they just pack that pollen and nectar into their hind legs in sort of a big saddlebag that you'll see, big wet saddlebag that bumblebees carry their pollen around in. And we'll see some pictures of that later. Bees are also excellent. So in addition to just moving pollen intentionally through the landscape, they also have their behavior in general also makes them really good pollinators. So there are a range of what we call specialist and generalist bees. Some of the specialist bees will only visit one species or one genus of plants. And then there are others like bumblebees. Actually, most bumblebees are generalists that'll visit almost any flower. And they're also what we call central place foragers, which means that they're nest based. So most of those other animals that I shared, those 6 invertebrates, most of those, once they hatch as adults, they're not nest based. So their foraging are moving through the landscape. Sometimes in the case of butterflies, hundreds or thousands of miles. And so one of the cool things about bees is if you're able to create nesting habitat, you can get reliable pollination services because those bees are going to be foraging near their nest. They're also what we call, they exhibit something we call flower constancy. And this basically just recognizes the fact that all flowers have different morphologies, and different bees learn how to take pollen off of different flowers with different levels of efficiency. And once they get really good at it, they can go back to that same species of flower and get pollen very, very quickly, as opposed to having to learn a new flower every time they go to it. And so one of the outcomes of this is that a bee is actually visiting, or will often visit, the same species of flower consecutively. And if you're a flower trying to have your pollen go to the female parts of another flower, you want it to go to the same species, right? We don't, different species of flower, different species of plants, often can't reproduce if pollen is shared across species. Plants are weird, so sometimes that can happen, but it usually doesn't happen. And so a flower wants its pollen to stay within the same group of species. And so having that flower constancy that bees exhibit is really, really important. One of the interesting things is we have a tremendous diversity of bees on the planet, but when most people think about bees, they think about the honeybee. And so right now I have a poll question for you, just to get some sense of where you are on this spectrum. True or false? Most species of bees make honey. We have a very well-informed audience. This is good. All right, looks like most of you have responded, and I'll share the results with you. So most of you responded false. You said that most bees do not make honey. And that is true. Most bees do not make honey. In fact, very few of the world's 20,000 species of bees make appreciable amounts of honey. There are no native species in North America, north of Mexico, that make honey. There are some stingless bees in Mexico that do make honey that's harvested and used by the native peoples down there, but there are no native bees in North America, north of Mexico, that make honey. And if you're hearing this for the first time, this means that honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought here in the 1600s, largely for their honey production and also for their wax production, which helped with making candles. So you guys are all sharp. Good job. And just to introduce you a little bit to North America's bee diversity, there are around, or to the world's bee diversity, there are around 20,000 species in the world, including Mexico. North America has around 5,200 species of bees. And then north of Mexico in the US and Canada, we have around 3,600 species of bees. These bees come in a diversity of sizes and shapes. This is North America's smallest bee, Perdita minima, on the face of North America's largest bee in the genus Xylocopa, which is a carpenter bee. And this is to scale. So this is a very small animal on top of an animal that's around 2 inches or so, maybe in length. So it's huge size diversity. We also have beautiful bright green sweat bees and other bright green bees. We have mining bees that emerge early in the spring and nest in the ground. We have leafcutter bees that cut holes out of leaves and line their nests with them. We have a whole host of cuckoo bees, which are like cuckoo birds in that they invade the nests of other bee species and actually lay their eggs on the pollen that other bees have collected. So kind of a sneaky life cycle. And then we have our bumblebees, and we have several species of bumblebees. I'll introduce you to a lot of them throughout the course of the day. This is an eastern species called Sanderson's bumblebee. This is a western species called Bombus flavifrons, or the yellow-headed bumblebee. And so all in all, of the 3,600 species of native bees in North America, only 50 of those species are bumblebees. And that's less than 2% of North America's native bees. And so some would ask, why are we spending so much time trying to conserve bumblebees if it's such a small slice of the diversity in North America? There are a few reasons for that. One of them is it's much easier to fill a workshop and get community scientists to come to a bumblebee workshop than it would be for a sweat bee workshop. That's just a fact of the matter. And so that in and of itself has value. But because bumblebees are so broadly distributed and they're pretty much in every ecosystem that other bees exist in, when we're working on bumblebee conservation, bumblebees can serve as an umbrella species for a lot of these other animals. There are some specialist bees that we have to think particularly about, both in their nesting and in their food habits. But for the most part, bumblebees serve as really good umbrella species for a lot of the other bee species that are out there. That doesn't mean we're not also working on the conservation of other bee species. It just takes a different approach. Bumblebees are also a lot easier to identify from photographs, and the technical expertise required to identify many other bee species to species is extremely challenging and requires a taxonomist and a microscope. So that it makes it a lot easier to work on bumblebees from an atlas perspective as well. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of pollination and why that matters and where bumblebees fit into that picture. And now as we begin to think about bumblebees specifically for the rest of the day, what is it about their ecology? And this is important to think about for a number of different reasons, not just for sort of basic understanding, but also from a when do we survey, where do we survey, how often do we survey, perspective of just, and how do we conserve them, right? How do we manage lands while we think about their life cycle? And so all of these things are important, which is why we take the time to share this information with you. This is a map that was made by Paul Williams, who is a biologist at the Natural History Museum in London, who specializes in bumblebees. And he made this graph basically of bumblebee diversity throughout the world. And you can see if you look at this map, the redder the color, the more species of bees that there are. And the cooler the color, the fewer species of bees there are. So you can see that the biodiversity hotspot for these animals is really in the Himalayas and in China, where there are as many as 70 different species in some places. There's also a fairly high diversity in Europe, where there's 40 in the 40s number of species. And then here in Western North America is also another biodiversity hotspot, where there's upwards of 30 different species of bumblebees. And if we zoom in and take a look at that map of North America, you can see that there's a lot of diversity in Montana, but also along the spine of the Cascades and the spine of the Rockies, as well as in the coastal areas of the Pacific Northwest, is where we see a lot of this tremendous diversity in North America. And the Pacific Northwest has so much diversity because from the coast to the Intermountain West is about 100 miles, and it goes through so many diverse ecosystems, from our wet temperate rainforests to high alpine to temperate prairies to high desert, and all in the course of 150 miles. And that leads to a lot of different speciation, particularly for a cold weather specialist like bumblebees. And if we zoom in a little bit deeper and look just at Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, this is what species richness sort of looks like historically. So the darker areas that you see on this map, the darker blues, had the most species. And not a huge surprise here. We're looking at sort of the spine of the Cascades, and then up into the North Cascades, and then a little bit there into Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, which encompasses like the Blue Mountains and the Wallowas and places like that. And from the results from our first Atlas project, you can see that pretty much across the board, a lot of the colors have decreased in their intensity of blueness. So I'll go back to historic, and here's current. So historic and current. So the polygons that you see here are what we call ecoregions. They're parts of the Pacific Northwest, or really of North America, that we've divided up based on their ecological attributes. So climate, vegetation, things like that. That's what these polygons are. And so when we look at species richness at sort of a polygon level, it looks like maybe we're losing species of bumblebees throughout the Pacific Northwest. And in fact, when we look at that map more specifically, you can see that, you know, in the Cascades and along the Coast Range and in the Puget Trough, it looks like we may have lost as many as 4 species of bumblebees from our historic numbers. And so this is concerning, right? Not a great story to say that you've lost a bunch of species. And so this led us to ask some questions, mostly, you know, how confident are we that we've lost these species? And so to do this, as one of the things you can do is look at what's called the species accumulation curve. And this is a rudimentary species accumulation curve, I'll say. The orange line that you see here is the accumulation of species on the y-axis there, according to the number of observations. So let me get out a little laser pointer here. So this is the total number of observations that it took to get this many number of species. So if we follow the historic line through time, you can see that, you know, we got to around 900 observations in the first iteration of the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, which is this blue line. And you can see after that, historically, is when we picked up, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more species. And so this would indicate that the current survey effort that we've put forth may not be enough to capture the species richness in the Willamette Valley. So this is a place where we say, we should probably do some more sampling in the Willamette Valley and see if we can pick up some additional species, because that's what happened historically, right? There were some of these more common ones. We found them very quickly, but it took a little bit more effort to find some of the rarer ones. So this is a place where we probably have some more work to do. You zoom in on the Blue Mountains ecosystem or ecoregion, and it's a little bit of a different picture. You can see that historically, we got to the maximum number of species at around 2,000 observations. And in the first iteration of the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, we got around 2,000 observations, and we stayed constant for a fairly long period of time. So in the Blue Mountains, maybe we're pretty confident in saying that we've, you know, lost a couple of species from that area. It looks pretty likely that we've lost species there. Cascades, similar to the Willamette Valley. It looks like we have more surveying to do. So we get to go look for bumblebees in the high mountains of the Cascades. That's a good job, right? We'll take that. And then also in the Puget Lowlands. So this is the Puget Trough around the Seattle area. You can see that we really haven't done enough sampling to be confident in this, although we're getting pretty close. I will say that this observation here, this is actually the addition of Bombus impatiens, which is the common eastern bumblebee that's actually invading from escape from commercial hives or commercial nests rather. So this isn't a great one to be picking up. So we're probably getting closer to this in the Puget Trough here of getting close, but we certainly have some more work to do. And so we've added some cells in the Puget Trough to sample over the next few years as well. So that's just sort of an overview of our basic understanding and some of these ecoregions and some of the thinking that's gone into the development of the second iteration of this project that we'll learn more about as we go throughout the day. But diving sort of beyond a species richness perspective, what does the ecology of bumblebees look like? There's around, as we've said, there's around 50 species in North America. And here it says most species are social colonies founded by a single queen. And they have what's called they have an annual life cycle, which means that colonies only last one season. So queens last for 1 year. They found a nest in the spring. That nest ends in the fall, and that queen dies at that point. So it's only the new queens that survive the year. So every queen basically lives for 1 year. Bumblebee nests are found in abandoned rodent burrows, under thatched grasses and brush piles, rock walls, sometimes in buildings, sometimes in bird nests. As I said, the queen emerges in the spring, and she emerges from a hibernacula where she's spent all winter. she can spend a couple of weeks, it's believed, looking for a nesting site. And it's thought that sometimes competition for nesting sites can be quite intense. We've talked a little bit about where those nests could be. Abandoned rodent burrows tend to be very important here, largely because bumblebees need an existing cavity. They can't dig their own nest. They need to find an existing hole, and ideally a hole with insulation to help them regulate temperature of their nests. And so abandoned rodent burrows fill this bill pretty comprehensively. It's believed that soil moisture and sun can play a role in where these nesting sites are. And then in the summertime, once the queen has found a nest, she will start to lay her eggs, and she builds these waxen pots, and she fills the waxen pots with pollen mixed with a little bit of nectar. So it's like a pollen cake. And then she lays her eggs directly on those. And then she'll spend some time feeding. Once the eggs actually hatch, she'll spend some time feeding her larvae as they eat through the pollen stores that are in that waxen pot. And she'll also spend some time incubating those eggs to keep them at the right temperature for rapid development. And then eventually those larvae, after they've gone through a number of instars, they're like butterflies. They go through complete metamorphosis. So they pupate just like caterpillars do, and then emerge as a winged adult. And that process from egg to winged adult takes about 5 weeks, which is a fairly long time period. But at that point, once that first sort of eggs have hatched as winged adults, that's when the queen bumblebee has a worker caste. And at that point, she will no longer leave the nest. She just stays and tends to her egg laying and feeding duties. And the workers are the ones that are bringing the resources into the nest to help the colony grow. So at this point, if there are enough workers, is when colony production can take off quite rapidly. But just as an aside, because we're coming out of this period right now, this period when after queens come out to find a nest, and this 5 weeks until workers come out, a lot of people seem to get worried that we've lost our bumblebees or there's no bumblebees this year. And then all of a sudden you find that sort of almost overnight, these workers pop and they're out in the landscape. Because when these queens are incubating their eggs and stuff, they're not out foraging as much as they were before. And so there is often this lull period where we don't see many bumblebees for a while. But I think we're through that now. I'm seeing workers of many different species, even right here in my yard. And then in the fall, after the colony has gotten big enough, the queen will switch from producing workers to producing new queens and males. And those once the males hatch, they actually pretty much immediately leave the nest and they don't return. They don't collect pollen. They don't do any of these things. They just go out and basically look for mates. They sleep on vegetation. Sometimes they fly patrolling routes looking for females. And sometimes they just sort of perch on vegetation looking for or releasing hormones to attract mates to them. And the female, the new queens, she'll actually go out and forage, look for pollen and nectar, also likely find a mate. But she does return to the nest and continue to benefit from the resources and protection of the nest until she's built up enough fat reserves to hibernate. And at that point, she will leave the nest and dig her own hibernacula. So they do extract their own hibernacula. And it's not exactly known where this is for a lot of species. Sometimes for some species, they seem to overwinter in these large aggregations, several hundred, even in the same location. Other species seem to do it very far from each other and in very low densities. But we don't really know what soil types or vegetation is important for this. And there's a lot of work going on to gather some of this information even still. So just from a linear perspective, what does it look like? So we start in the early spring. The queen emerges from her hibernacula, which is a shallow hole in the ground. She flies around and looks for a nesting site. She starts that nesting site, starts laying her eggs. Eventually, she no longer leaves the nest, and the workers are the ones bringing resources in. The colony can get quite big. Some species can have 500 to 1,000 individuals in it. And then after the resources are built up, the new queens and males are produced. they find each other and mate. And then at that point, the newly mated queens find a place to overwinter, and the foundress queen and the males and the workers, they all die. And then the colony starts anew the following spring. So here's the life cycle in a circular fashion. Here's a bumblebee hibernacula. Here's starting its nest, and sort of here's through the summer and then the fall, and then refining the hibernacula. So that's just a circular view of it. And the reason that we're looking at it this way is there's also this group of animals, or bumblebees. There's 3 species in the Pacific Northwest that are called cuckoo bumblebees. And they have this interesting life cycle where they actually don't collect any of their own pollen. They invade the nests of other bees, and they are dependent on the worker caste of that foundress species to continue to bring resources in. And so this cuckoo bumblebee actually needs to invade the nest at a very sensitive time of year. She has to invade the nest when there's enough resources that a worker caste is beginning or will at least hatch in the near future. But she can't invade it so late that that worker caste has already hatched and can help repel her from the nest, because she'll invade the nest and basically overtake or kill the queen. And then the workers basically start working for this cuckoo bee. And so very interesting life cycle, but a very sensitive time of year here that the queen or the female Cytherus or cuckoo bee needs to find a way to invade. And because these bees no longer collect pollen over time, they've actually lost their corbicula. And so that's one of the ways that we can tell cuckoo bees from the true bees is they look a lot more armored. They're ready for attacking and stinging because that's what they do, but they also don't have the corbicula. So they don't have those same things that we look at. And we'll get into that later. Where do we find bumblebees? Well, in the Pacific Northwest, you can see this is a chart that shows you surveys from the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas Project from 2018 to 2020. And the blue bars that you see here are where our volunteers collected surveys over the first 3 years of the project. So the majority of surveys actually took place in developed areas, so this could have been parks or roadsides. And then the second most was grasslands and meadows. And one of the things to see here is even though there were fewer surveys in grasslands, right? There's fewer surveys in grasslands than there were in developed areas. We found a lot more bumblebees in grasslands and meadows than we did in developed areas. So this says that grasslands and meadows are probably important for bumblebees. All of the other areas, basically the number of surveys or the percentage of surveys didn't match up to the percentage of bumblebees. So, shrub scrub is a particular one there where we did a fair number of surveys there and we didn't detect as many bumblebees. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do surveys in shrub scrub. It just means that grasslands and meadows is where we find the most abundant populations of bees or of bumblebees in the Pacific Northwest. One of the things that's interesting is you can also look at this by species, right? So there are some species that are indeed grassland meadow specialists, like Bombus appositus. We find, you can see a large proportion of its observations were in grasslands and meadows. Same with Bombus flavidus and Bombus frigidus and Bombus sylvicola. These are all meadow specialists. We had other species that were woodland or forest specialists. So like Bombus van Dijkii, almost 2/3 of its observations were in forests. Other species were shrub scrub. So, Bombus nevadensis was found regularly in shrub scrub. Same with Bombus fervidus and Bombus centralis. So these are our drier east side species. So anyway, it's very interesting to look at how different species have different preferred habitats. It's not the same across all species. That said, I've shared a lot of information about bumblebee ecology with you. It's also important to just let you know there's a fair bit of uncertainty here as well. So it's not, we don't know everything. Comparing this to sort of mammals and birds, we actually, we're decades behind our level of understanding. We know very little about where bumblebees overwinter. And this is where they spend half of their life cycle. So this is a very significant gap that's missing in our understanding and for conservation. So we need to learn more about this. And the Xerces Society has partnered with the USGS to gather some of this information with a new project called Queen Quest. So if you're interested in participating in more bumblebee conservation efforts, would welcome you to join that project as well. We also know very little about where a lot of species nest. We have observations like from the early 1900s that were collected by a few biologists, but that's a lot of what we know. And so we're hoping to gather more information about habitat associations here and other important things that we need to learn in order to conserve their habitat. So obviously their nests are as important as their food plants. So we can't just put flowers on the ground to conserve bumblebees. We also have to think about their nesting sites, et cetera, et cetera. There are other issues that we just don't know that much about. We know very little about queen dispersal and male dispersal, how far they overwinter from their nest, how far males travel to find a mate. We know very little about what makes a healthy population, or what reproduction even looks like, how many individuals a female mates with. We have some observations of this, but not a whole lot. So there's still a lot to be learned. So that's an overview of bumblebee ecology. I'm now going to dive into a little bit here to just the value of bumblebees, which again gets at why we're spending so much time conserving this sort of narrow slice of native bees in North America. There's four main things that that contribute value for, or that shows the value of bumblebees. One is their physiology. They have really unique physiology in that they're basically able to regulate their own body temperature. So if the external temperatures are are quite cold, they're actually able to detach their flight muscles from their wings and vibrate themselves or shake themselves and warm themselves up such that they can fly, almost making them equivalent of being what we would say warm-blooded. I mean, they're not warm-blooded, but they can do this to a certain degree. And this allows them to fly in cold temperatures. And in the Pacific Northwest, when it's cold and wet in the spring, when most other species of bees can't or won't leave the nest, bumblebees have to. They have to be out there, gathering their pollen resources at that time. And so you can find them flying in the snow, in the cold, in the rain, and they're out there just doing their work. They're also very intelligent. They can learn how to use resources uniquely. I'm going to show you a video here in a minute that illustrates that. They also have very long tongues. This allows them to access the nectaries of many different shapes and sizes of plants, which makes them important pollinators of those plants. And then they're also quite innovative and strong, and they're able to, this is a picture on the far right there is a picture of a plant called bottle gentian. And the corolla tube of that flower never opens up. But bumblebees have figured out how to put their tongue and then their head and then their whole body down into that corolla tube, crawl down in there, get the pollen and nectar, and then move on to the next flower and do the same thing. And this is an obligate relationship, one of the few plants that's dependent on bumblebees for pollination services. And bumblebees have figured out how to do this with other gentians as well. This is the video I was going to show you. It's just a cool couple-minute video that shows how well bumblebees are actually able to learn from researchers and then from each other. So in this first section here, the researcher is trying to train the bumblebee that if she rolls that ball into the center of that yellow circle, it falls on that white cage and actually releases nectar from underneath. And so the bee basically learns that if it does this task, it gets this sugar reward. And after she's trained, she can do this quite quickly in anticipation or to get her flower sugar reward. And one of the cooler things about this is that bumblebees not just learn from researchers, but they can also learn from each other. So just by watching other bees do this, they can actually learn to do this too. And then we also learn that bumblebees can do calculus and figure out how to do the least amount of work for the most reward. So they regularly would choose the ball closest to the circle to do that work and get the quick, rapid reward. And this level of sort of thinking and understanding is well beyond what we would expect from an invertebrate. It's had previously only been seen in like octopuses and dolphins and primates, basically learning from watching other animals. So this is a pretty incredible degree of intelligence that's shown through these unique research that was done by this research team. All of these things make bumblebees incredibly important pollinators of many wild and cultivated and agricultural plants, including tomatoes and peppers and blueberries and cranberry and clover and squash and apples and many others. And one of the things that make bumblebees such great pollinators of some of these crops is their ability to buzz pollinate. And buzz pollination basically means that they're going to some of these flowers where actually the pollen is locked up inside the anthers of the flower, and it needs to be vibrated in order to get out. And you can see this GIF of this that you're seeing right now on the screen is a bumblebee doing just that. She's latched her mouth parts onto the flower, she's detached her flight muscles from her wings, and she's vibrating her body at a particular frequency. And that's causing the pollen to come shooting out of the plant, kind of like a salt shaker. And many bees, or most bees, actually can't do this. Honeybees can't do this, and most native bees are too small to do this, most other solitary native bees. And so bumblebees are really good buzz pollinators. And there are around 10% or maybe 8% of the plants on the planet that benefit from buzz pollination, including the list of plants that you see here. And so these are all of the reasons why bumblebees are such important and significant contributors to ecosystem services and ecosystem function in our climate and throughout much of the world. There are a number of bumblebee species that are in decline. Our understanding of bumblebee conservation or of the declines started in probably the mid-2000s. At that time, there was a researcher by the name of Dr. Robin Thorpe, who was a mentor of mine actually around this time, who discovered that these two species of bees, the Western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee, which are two focal species in our project, had disappeared from his study sites. And at that time, he sort of raised the red flag and said, hey, there's issues going on with bee conservation here in the West. And there were other researchers, Leif Richardson included, on the eastern United States that had noticed the decline of the rusty-patched bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee on the East Coast. And so at that time, we recognized there were some pretty major factors going on. And a group of scientists got together and formed the Bumblebee Specialist Group. And the Bumblebee Specialist Group is part of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. And the role of this group is to assess the extinction risk of bumblebees everywhere they're native. Again, this reflects that map that I showed you earlier. These are all the areas with native bumblebee species. And we've now assessed this group of scientists, for which I'm the Red List Authority, which means that sort of helping to coordinate some of these extinction risk analyses, have finished assessing the species in the Western Hemisphere. So the American species, North, Meso, and South America have been assessed. And what we found is that around a quarter of the species are facing some degree of extinction risk. 4 of them were critically endangered and 2 of them were endangered. And this is reflected also in the US Fish and Wildlife Service's Endangered Species Act. There's 1 species that's been protected as an endangered species. There's another species that's proposed endangered. And then there's 4 or 5 other species that have been petitioned for endangered species protection. And some of these species live close to home and are the focus of this project. One of them is the Western bumblebee, whose historic relative abundance was relatively high, between sort of 3 and 15% of all bees that we would find in much of the Pacific Northwest used to be this species. And now throughout most of its range, it's less than 3%. So we've lost a significant number of these bees, it seems like. While they seem to be persisting in many areas, although notably absent west of the Cascade Sierra Crest, they seem to be somewhat persisting in but at much lower levels than they did historically. Bombus sucklei is another focus of our species of this project. It used to be, fairly rare. So it was about 3% historically, which is true of most cuckoo bumblebees. They're just not as common as other true bumblebees. But we didn't detect it at all in the first region of this project, or the first version of this project. So this is a huge focus for the second version, is to really try to find observations of this species. And we'll talk later about how we're trying to accomplish that. And then Morrison's bumblebee, Bombus morrisoni, historically was, around 3%, had some areas where it was more common, 3 to 7%. And it's largely maintained that, although its relative abundance has dropped within those buckets. So this is sort of 0.1 to 3% where it was. Historically, it was much closer to 3%, whereas now it's much closer to 0% in a lot of these areas. Some of these have only 2 or 3 observations in them over the last 3 years. And then there's other species that we found that seem to be doing just fine. Bombus huntii, a sort of drier east side species, has persisted throughout much of its former range at the same levels where it was historically. And so this all sort of makes a conservation biologist ask these questions of, why are some species thriving? Why are other species in trouble? What's going on that's unique to these species that are struggling? There must be something about their biology that's different. And we're sort of trying to pull those pieces together, or put those pieces together to figure that out, so that we can reverse the trends and try to help some of these rare species get back to where they once were. The reality of this is there's a lot of factors out there. There's no single cause of decline. There's likely a combination of factors that have led to a lot of these things. So bees have a unique genetic makeup. Pesticides are very prevalent throughout North America and the world. We have dwindling food supplies as we convert, prairies into farm fields. And then, add in disease and pathogens, climate change, and all these factors interacting with each other, and you get a situation that's really challenging on a lot of different animals. It's just like us, right? When we're stressed out, we're more likely to get sick. We're more likely to get a cold when we're stressed out, or when we have other things going on in our lives. And it's the same thing with bees. They're stressed, and we keep adding more factors to stress them out, and that's leading to a lot of these declines. I mentioned disease uniquely just because this is a global factor. We've been moving commercial bumblebees all over North America, or all over the world, and this has led to declines on every continent where we have native bees. So here in North America, there are 4 different species that are threatened from disease. In South America, there's a bumblebee that's threatened by disease from a introduced animal, and the same thing's going on in Europe and in Japan. And so everywhere on the planet, basically, where we're moving these animals around, it's creating unique problems. Okay. And, just to sort of hammer this home, is this idea of, these interacting factors are just a huge factor as we think about, adding poor nutrition on top of insecticides and pathogens and fungicides and all these other things that we add up to them. But, there are uncertainties, so we don't know exactly what's happening. But I think, the community of researchers working on these things feel that we're in a place now where we need to act. Even if we don't know exactly what to do, we need to act. So we need to start putting conservation measures on the ground as soon as possible. And the Xerces Society is doing that. That's where we're sort of spearheading bumblebee conservation throughout North America. We're trying to fill a lot of these information gaps by launching these atlas projects. In addition to that, we are putting bumblebee habitat in the ground throughout North America. And bumblebee habitat means 4 things. It means we need to put food in the ground. We need to protect shelter in overwintering places. We need to connect these landscapes. And we need to reduce the amount of toxic pesticides, especially in our ornamental settings. We really need to reduce these chemical inputs. And so we need to put flowering resources out there from early spring through late fall. And it's important to recognize that not all plants are the same. So some plants actually are bred just for their looks and they don't have any pollen and nectar. So when you're selecting bee plants, make sure that you're choosing native plants that are still functioning and creating pollen and nectar. These double petaled varieties that we find in pansies and other things are not food for bees. They're just color. And in addition, there's a lot of nursery plants that are pre-treated with toxic insecticides. So make sure to talk to your nurseries and make sure that the plants that you're buying are safe for bees. Some of these neonicotinoids and other pesticides will stay in the plant for up to 7 years, particularly for woody plants. So you really have to be careful. Xerces has put out a couple of webinars and publications recently about this, about how to buy plants. So head on over to Xerces' website or to Xerces' YouTube channel to check out some of these resources. Lastly, one of the important things to think about, whoops, sorry, I chose the wrong slide or advanced to the wrong slide. I'm not sure how that happened. One of the other things that we really want to consider here is beekeeping. And so beekeeping, while it is a tremendous hobby and a really fun thing to do, honeybees are fascinating creatures. They are social insects and you stand to learn a lot from them by interacting with them. But unfortunately, there's a lot of mouths to feed in a honeybee hive. There can be between 10 to 50,000 different mouths to feed. And so they extract a lot of resources from the landscape. And in an already stressed environment, putting honeybees out there just takes more of those resources away. It's research has been done that shows that, you know, a honeybee colony over the course of a few months can extract the pollen equivalent of millions of native bees. So this can have a major effect on ecosystems. And we also know that honeybees are transmitting diseases to our native bees. A lot still has to be learned about the effects of those diseases that are being transferred, but there are effects. And you know, we, in this case, sort of urge using the precautionary principle. Our native bees are incredibly important for pollinating 85% of the wild plants on the planet. And while honeybees are important agricultural pollinators, they're not the key pollinators in our wildlands that are feeding our wildlife. And so protecting our native pollinators needs to be paramount. And so if you choose to be a beekeeper, I have no problem with that, but do it for the right reasons. Do it because you want honey and you want to learn from a social insect. Don't do it for bee conservation. Being a honeybee keeper for bee conservation is like having chickens for bird conservation. And we just don't do that, right? We don't have chickens for bird conservation. We have chickens because they're cool animals, they're fun to learn from, and we can get eggs. And it's basically the same boat with honeybees. They're cool animals, we get honey, they're beautiful, they're fun. And if you want to do it for that reason, great. But if you want to be involved in bee conservation and you're looking for a way to get involved, we would encourage you to create habitat. That is the best thing you can do for both honeybees and for native bees. And that is the end of the first module. I am happy to address any questions if there's any out there.
We only have one question that's lingering, but we're going to get to that one after the break. It was a particular question about habitat assessment type stuff. So we'll table that one for a little while. Other than that, we're all caught up.
Sounds good. Thanks, Joel. We taught one of these workshops last Monday and Wednesday, and there was a couple of people that asked for a little bit of break between these two modules. So I'm going to just give you all a 3-minute break to go get a glass of water or use the bathroom or whatever. And we'll come back at 1:25 and I will start the second module at 1:25.